I'm Jonna Till Johnson. I'm the CEO of Nemertes, and I'm here with my co-host, Greg Farrow, co-founder of Packet Pushers, and John Burke, CTO of Nemertes. And you are listening to Heavy Strategy, the show that gives you the right questions, not the right answers, or I should say, strives to give you the right questions, not the right answers. Today's show is a little bit different because it's the last Heavy Strategy episodes featuring Greg, who is, as many of you know, retiring. It's a sad day, but it's also a happy day because we are celebrating all the incredible things that Greg has actually done, which I'm going to get him to talk about, or at least as best I can on this show. And I would also just like to reassure listeners of Heavy Strategy that Heavy Strategy will go on. John Burke will be stepping up. As nobody can replace Greg, it will not be the same. It will be different, but hopefully different in the right way and in the way that still resonates with the folks who've been listening. So with that, Greg, this is kind of a all about you kind of show. So get ready to be on the hot seat.
Okay. I don't like talking about personal stuff. So this is, I will probably avoid the truly personal stuff and just talk about stuff that, that I will allow to be put in public. Because I don't believe just because you're on social media doesn't mean you have to share the color of your underpants, right? You should have a content that the people want to listen to, and people don't need to know anything about me outside of the podcast, in my opinion, generally.
Yep. But I would say this is a little bit special. So I'm just going to ask if you had to pick a couple of themes that have defined you professionally and personally throughout your entire working life, like who are you really? And I'll give you an example. If you look at my bio, it says adventurer because I do a lot of that. It also says researcher, engineer. Like, who are you?
I think the term I've used most often is too stupid to give up. I think is
that a polite way of saying stubborn?
Yeah, well, most people, if you're one of the sort of people that believes in, success strategies and goal orientation and all of that, basically all of that is just can be boiled down into being too stupid to give up or persistence, right? If you work at something for long enough with the right focus and the right attitude, then you'll generally get good at something, right? It doesn't really matter what that thing is. And a smart person, as I sometimes say, would give up. Like a smart person would give up and go to the pub and drop out and go and do a normal job instead of doing the jobs that we do, right? Because the sort of stuff that, the three of us have done, John and Jonah and myself, we've always wanted to keep going, to learn more, to understand more, to advance, to progress. And the secret to that is to treat your life like a marathon, not a sprint, right? And this is what I mean. A smart person would sprint for a while and then give up and they go off and do something else, right? Because they'd say, look, this is too hard. This idea of spending hundreds of hours mastering a technology or learning how to speak business speak because people in business are stupid and can't speak technology, right? So my vision of all of this has been be too stupid to give up. The corollary to this, Jonah, is make sure that the thing that you're doing is worth doing.
I was going to jump in and interrupt you as I often do, because I will say that goes counter to the advice that you give people a lot of times, which is, you know what? If they're asking you to do too much, if they're asking you to work too hard, just quit. So I just want to ask how you square those things.
That's easy because the job is the job. That is not your career, right? Your career is something that lasts 40 years, right? And the career exists independently of companies. The companies are it's like dating, right? The way I look at my current employer, when I was out there, whoring myself for money, was just the people who I was working for at the time. I would go in, they would pay me money, I would work. That's irrelevant. The company that you work for doesn't matter, except in terms of the opportunities they can give you, in terms of will they hire you when you're there? Can you deliver fair value for the money they're paying you for? And when they stop treating you right, you walk off because your career is important, not the company you work for. It's the career that you've got to be stupid about, not the employer.
Well, and I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivations. Don't give up if it's something you're doing for you. Do give up if somebody's putting you in a position that just makes no sense, which is what you've said over and over again on these on Heavy Strategy. Yeah.
Too many people get my father was he worked for the same employer for nigh on 45 years, right? He was recruited at 15, came in as an apprentice, and he worked for a government department, and then right the way through his working life until he retired, he was working for them. And they made it worth his while. The retirement scheme was awesome, and there was a quid pro quo. They, when the times were bad, they stuck with him and so on and so forth. That is not modern life for 90% of people. The modern life is if the numbers don't work, you're out, right? And it is not an emotional decision. Once upon a time, we talked about this before, like capitalism was actually invented back into sort of like the mid 1700s, like around the 1750, and it sort of emerged, when the first version of capitalism came out. And the idea was that capital could be mobile, and the very nature of taking capital and investing it in business means that it improves society as a whole. And the reason for that was that in the mid 1700s, the money was all tapped up in the land.
I was going to say money was land. So yeah, and it's not mobile.
Land was money. And because they could produce profits from the land by having people work on the land. But those people were trapped in those employers and the work was tedious and dull and not a whole lot of value add. And so they came along and started building factories, and they said, well, and smart aristocrats, the aristocratic people, the people with the money would start taking the money that they were generating from that land and started to build factories. And then the people who got into factories got paid more money. They were able to then have better lives. They became the middle class. And so instead of having upper class, lower class, the middle class emerged. And that was regarded by in the social fabric. This is how it was seen as a Christian thing to do, to lift people out of poverty so that they didn't starve when the crops were bad, so that they had jobs, that they could have nice clothes and have a consistent form of food. I believe in, my personal view is that that's the form of capitalism that I believe in. And that is, to some extent, that faded away sometime around the 1980s, 1990s. And we're now into a sort of bare knuckle capitalism where
the greed is
really
good, Gordon
matter.
Gekko,
There's no
all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's right.
It doesn't matter how much profit.
It's treating people like a strip mineable resource. You go in, you tear it out, you leave a great big pit behind you. And it's not sustainable, which I think folks are discovering.
Yeah, and the classic is that something we've talked about a lot, which is the private equity comes in, buys up a technology company. What they do is the technology company was having, good cash flows. It had some good assets, but it wasn't performing, 30% gross margin. It might have been doing 50% gross margin,
or it wasn't aligned with the strategy for growth or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And all that sort of stuff. So they come in, they strip the company, they load it up with debt because it didn't have any debt. And that was how it was able to be successful. And when debt was zero, and then all of a sudden they put it back out on the market, and then it collapses because it's got to service the debt and it can't. And then it goes broke. That's the sort of capitalism I think that is, we could rightly criticize and point to it and say, if you're a pure capitalist, and you hate everybody and you don't believe in society, you just believe in personal gain, you could say, I'm doing you a favor. If I'm taking that company out of the gene pool, then that company shouldn't have existed in the first place. And the flip side is a lot of people got damaged on the way through. And, is that something that you should morally be doing? I would ask that question.
And I'm just laughing. Go ahead, John.
Is there any company you couldn't kill that way, though? I mean, if you just took the approach of killing its resources and loading it up with debts, couldn't you just sink anything that way?
Well, of course you can. But the question here is, should we be allowing that to happen? I mean, I was reading an article this week, and they were looking back at management research. Like these books come out and they talk about success, the secrets of 7 highly successful companies or whatever, right? And this author goes out and researches them in depth and says, these are the examples. And this person did a meta research of about 34 different business books from back over the last 20 years and pointed out that 50% of the companies that they were holding up as successful companies all blew up. Right. So at one point in time, they were highly successful, and then they weren't. And then they became highly successful again, some of them. The point is that if you go in and take them out of the gene pool, they can't revitalize. It's like I like to think of it as like a sick human. The reason that we have social healthcare systems in many countries around the world is that if you get sick and you can't work, you fall out of the system. And if you've got social healthcare or access to social healthcare, you can be fixed and then come back into the workforce and then contribute back to the society that you're in by creating tax revenue and, contributing to the healthcare system. You don't lose the productivity of that person. And I believe that sort of companies should be considered in a similar sort of a vein. In if you're not performing well now, that doesn't mean that you can't go through a period of bad health and then return to good health, if that makes sense.
That does,
Right.
but I was just sort of laughing and thinking to myself, yeah, except when AI comes along and then kicks all of us out and then we're all done. But that's a whole different conversation we could have later.
AI
I'll
won't
ask
kick
you, though,
anybody out. Just
one,
move things around.
no, I agree with you 100%, which is why we haven't debated it, because there's no debate. We agree. I just want to ask you, though, Greg, like zeroing in on just your podcasting career, what, if anything, has surprised you the most?
I think probably having announced my retirement and put an article out on LinkedIn, just how many people have come back and said how much I've been a part of their lives. So the thing is that for the last, say, 4 or 5 years, I've just been talking into the microphone. You and I, Jonah, have been on the microphone, and it's just us talking, and then we publish it, and there's no feedback. The feedback stopped a few years ago, but we have. I've got people in the LinkedIn stuff saying, you've absolutely helped me move from a tactical, I was a network engineer and I was able to take the knowledge that I learned from listening to you talk about heavy strategy. And that helped me become a network strategist. So I became an architect or a lead engineer because I was able to start talking business. I think I always knew that was out there, but I never realized just how many people took what we were doing on the podcast and turned it into a career advancement.
Well, and I think that's the other thing. That's one of the reasons why when you offered me the opportunity to join you on this, I jumped at it, because we were talking about this earlier. But folks that this podcast is aimed at are, I don't want to say the underappreciated, but typically the people who are, network engineers, cloud architects, cloud network architects, people that have reached the point in their careers of looking at how it all fits together, but realizing that their functional role is to just inform the person who gets the decision-making powers, the budget, and the glory of the options and the trade-offs for the options. And as you're going up that, moving from tactical to strategic, it's really important to understand the bigger picture things that are going on, and also position yourself to take the role that you want to take ultimately as you move through that. And that person is the person that I have the most emotional connection with.
And the challenge here is that when I started the podcast back in 2010 with Ethan, and I was saying to him, the biggest problem that I had at the time, or the biggest motivation, it wasn't a problem, but it was a problem for me, but not a problem for the audience, but was that I was never going to mentor anybody, because I was a freelance engineer moving from company to company, often on short-term contracts, and I was that guy. I was the outsider, right? I was never mentoring anybody. I wasn't sharing my knowledge or my expertise with anybody. They didn't, because I wasn't on their team. I was the guy brought in to, do something or whatever. And so part of the way that I started to do the podcast, or the way that I looked at how we would select our content, was to mentor people as best I could. And, that's just the way I thought about it, right? That I was a senior engineer, and if I just talked about the things as a senior engineer that I would share with a junior engineer, maybe that would be helpful to somebody. So, yeah. So if people are saying that it's helped them with their careers, that was the intention. That's what we strive for.
And so basically, I think what you're saying, just to rephrase it, is that what surprised you the most is the impact you had, I should say, because it's not going to go away. You think it's going to go away, but it's not going to go. But yes, I think that's wonderful.
And my favorite is that people who has picked up on some of my sayings over years. I'm just looking at the LinkedIn, and there's somebody here saying, "I will forever hear this sentence in your voice whenever chassis hardware is mentioned, when I said you inflicted a chassis upon yourself because you hate yourself." I was talking about Ethernet switch chassis.
Oh, that's a good one. And I was just thinking, I was just thinking about the meme that you had a couple minutes ago. Does the process know you're trusting it?
Here's another one. "You've been a source of inspiration. Your acidic and assertive comments made me feel very identified and helped me on a day-to-day basis with making technological decisions." Like, that's just a lovely thing to write, because that person is on the floor. They're the people making the decisions, using their skills and knowledge. To have influenced them in some way is an absolute privilege.
I agree. Well, let me turn to something, because I think it's a unique part about how you and Ethan view podcasting, which is the FU. and that stands for follow up, as all of you know. Are there any FUs that really just you, after all the years, you remember, oh my gosh, I remember when this person sent me this FU?
I think, well, this sort of continues the theme from the previous one. This was about 5 or 7 years ago. We got an email from a chap. He was telling a story that he started off as a junior engineer and he was listening to the podcast and he wanted to advance. And I think he was saying he was working a job. He was working 7 days a week, like 60 hours a week. He was working nights and weekends, and he was in meetings with the rest of the team. And then this was during the time of the Brocade acquisition. And during the shows, I think it was Network Break or Heavy Networking, we were talking about the future of Brocade and what the breakup would look like, because, Brocade was being bought by Broadcom. Broadcom really only wanted the fiber channel assets. What was going to happen to fiber channel? What was going to happen to the data center switching and the campus switching and the Wi-Fi? And of course, Broadcom acquired that business and sold the switching off to Dell. It sold the Wi-Fi off to Ruckus, if I remember rightly. They sold the data center switching off to Dell, and to this day it still runs a thing called FTOS because Brocade acquired Force 10 and Force 10 became Brocade, and then so FTOS is Force 10 OS, which was the Brocade acquisition. And he was saying that they were in a meeting and they were saying, well, what are we going to do? And he piped up and said, oh, well, what we think is going to happen. And he was able to regurgitate that in the meeting. And then on the back of that, over the next 6 months, he seemed to have answers to all of the problems, all of the strategy questions that they had. And he got a job as a senior network architect. And he said, my wife and I were able to realize our dream. All of a sudden, I jumped from earning this amount of money to earning twice the amount. I started working 40 or 50-hour weeks. I was able to be home at night. He said, I was still working and studying, but at least I was home. And he said, my wife and I were able to buy our dream house, and it's all because of you. That is when you know that you have a responsibility or a burden. And part of the reason that I'm leaving is that sort of get those messages occasionally, and that becomes a burden because then you feel like you have to step up. Does that make sense?
It does, because you take things very seriously. I mean, what I love about, the way you talk and the way you look at the world is you project this cynical, snarky, almost embittered persona that is completely at odds with your actual ethical, and I'm going to say it, man, loving, caring self. And you're like, no. Yeah. I don't do those soft, squishy things. I am cynical. I am hard bitten. I am logical. But that's what I think people are picking up, is that you have a very strong moral value system. You use it to inform absolutely everything you do. And yet you overlay that with a proper degree of cynicism that says, hey, you are being exploited. Pay attention when you're being exploited. It's, don't assume that everybody loves you. We're not in kindergarten here. And yet at the same time,
it's okay to be exploited. You might be in a situation where it's the right time, and to suck it up because you might be having a learning opportunity.
We call that paying your dues, but
So, I just want to make sure that
you have to be aware there's a transaction going on, and you have to understand what your half of the transaction is and what theirs is, and to be willing to leave it when you're no longer ready, which I think is actually a very key piece of advice and guidance that you've given folks over the years. Because I also look around and, the other theme that I often disagree with you on, but I think is important, is vendors are not your friends. Just because the actual human of the vendor may be a very good friend and a good person, in general, vendors are not your friends. And part of the problem when you're in IT is oftentimes vendors are the only people that make much of you. So you tend to fall into their embrace a little bit because, God, everybody else is telling you you're a loser and you haven't delivered that stuff fast enough, or it doesn't work to their level. And the vendor is like, nah, you're great, man. And you've just got to resist that and understand for what it is.
And that's just sales.
Yeah, that's just sales.
A key part of the sales training. I did do sales for a few years.
I wasn't bad at it. We never knew.
I wasn't very good at it because I got bored. Well, I did 2 years of enterprise IT sales. I was okay at it. But I got very bored because sales is an incredibly boring thing. Yeah,
because you do the same thing over and over and over. And there's nuances.
Find a person. Yeah.
Right. And even if you like people, at some point, just sort of meeting them on this very transactional basis is not super exciting. You want to have a more meaningful conversation, which just takes away from the sales process.
Yes. but you can only have a meaningful conversation if the person identifies with you in some way as a friend, in inverted commas, right? But then the mistake that you have, and for a lot of people in IT, we don't have a lot of friends, right?
Right.
We're probably on the spectrum to some extent. We're either, autistic, or we've got some ADHD. Usually the sort of obsessive nature of who we are, because that's part of what we self-select in that sort of dimension, because that's what you need to be able to be successful. If you're going to deep dive on a technology for 2 years, a little bit of autism is a helpful thing, right? And I think it's easy to just as soon as somebody pays attention to you, you just automatically you've got to control that and understand where the boundaries of that are. You have to be aware of your emotional self. And I've always tried to bring that in to people, right? But I've always couched that in a much more hard-bitten way, because you know what? When people say something, if only you were in touch with your emotions, you instantly
the first thing you want to do is go, no, leave me alone. Yes.
Yeah, right. And it's creepy when people say that. It's not real. It's not genuine. And it just comes across. It is actually correct. You do need to be in touch with your emotions if you're engaging in a deal, or a negotiation, because you can't let them run over the top of you. But you can't say that because it just sounds creepy. And you also sound like a salesperson, because that's exactly the methodology that they use to form a relationship with you.
Well, some of them do. Actually, some of the best ones are more like you, because it's like, you walk in and you say, okay, logically speaking, here's what's going on. Here's what I get out of the deal. Here's what you get out of the deal. What do you think? And if the deal is actually a good deal, you're probably going to go, yeah, that works for me. But that's another discussion. Another discussion we won't be able to have on Heavy Strategy because you are retiring. Good heavens. So kind of leading in on that, what advice would you give listeners generally? I mean, we've talked about know your boundaries. We've talked about this whole idea of don't lose sight of having, your own moral framework. But any other advice that leaps to mind?
So one of them that I've done a lot is if you can't be replaced, you can't be promoted. And I think a lot of people still sort of stick to this idea that if only I could be, it's so easy to get sucked into a mindset where I'm going to be the specialist in this and it'll be hard for them to get rid of me. And that's certainly a junior level. As somebody goes from a junior to a senior level, that's a transition that I think almost everybody goes through. They think if I could just be that person, then I'll be invaluable to the organization and they won't want to get rid of me. But if you can't be replaced, you can't be promoted, right? So if you're the only person who's the expert in loading paper into a printer, you can't then go on to another job inside the company, writing documents, which is where the money is, right? And keep in mind, there's another piece of advice. Don't live to work to live. The point here is that you need to earn money, right? If you're working to live, the goal is money. You want to go home at 5 o'clock. You want to start work at a certain time and you want to finish it at a certain time, and you want to have a life outside of work. That's why you go to work. And going back to the 1700s, the idea of an acre was that is how much land one man could plow, right, in a day. So if you had 10 acres, you could plow it for 10. It would take 10 days to plow it. And then you would come around again, and then you would go again, and you would, you fallow and blah, blah, blah. You plow a field multiple times a year.
All the farmy stuff, right?
All the farmy stuff, right? And so my point has always been is that everyone is replaceable. It might be expensive and it might be painful for the company, but you are replaceable. So that is the corollary, right? If you decide that you can't be replaced, the answer is you can always be. And if you are more painful than the process of replacing you, then the company will do that.
It actually puts a target on your back if you try and make yourself irreplaceable, because that's a bad thing for a manager to have in their stable of people, is someone who can't be replaced.
Well, you say that, but in IT, that's exactly what happens. There's only one network engineer. There's only one server engineer. There's one VMware engineer, right? But the assumption is that the company can't do it without you. They could just go and bring in a reseller or a professional services outfit and replace you, right? And so there's a delusion that you can easily fall into. And the thing that you need to realize is that no matter how much you might love working for your company, it doesn't love you back. A company is inherently unable to love you back. I'll come back to this definition of, the early capitalism as a social movement to what we have today, where it's just a profit generating mechanism for the rich people to a large extent, right? And so in this era, the company will never love you back. The people around you might say something to you. You might talk to HR and HR says, we value our talent. We value the people. But the real function of HR is to protect the company from you. That is labor laws, social thing. They don't want to see themselves splashed in the paper as being all. So the HR exists to protect you, the company, from you, not to make you feel good. The people in HR might genuinely believe that they're helping people, but their actual underlying purpose is to protect the company from you. So I don't ever call it human resources. I always call it human remains, because their job is to make sure that what's left of the person.
You've read
can be
Charles Strauss.
No, I don't think so, but resources. Probably. But yeah. Human remains is
surplus human resources, aka zombies. Were the security guards.
Yes, just a side note for anyone listening, Charles Strauss is a British science fiction writer who was a former IT guy. And some of his books are hysterically funny because of for example, you're going after Medusa, and Medusa, is she on the IPv6 network or not? I mean, it's that kind of level of accuracy and humor. So that's where John was going with that. And actually, Greg, you were talking about this, but I think one of the other things that folks listening should keep in mind is as you're moving up the strategic, I don't even want to say up the food chain, but more up the strategic value, one of the things you have to give up on is being the subject matter and expert. And that is the hardest thing for a lot of us to do, because we're used to being the smart person in the room who knows everything about whatever it is that we're supposed to, our domain. And over time, you have to get very comfortable not being that person. And that transition, a lot of people don't manage or navigate very well. They have to have some area where they're the smartest. And if that's you'll have trouble moving upwards. And we'll talk about that in an upcoming episode. But as you were talking, Greg, I was thinking about that.
Well, I think the reality is, as you last longer in technology and you have more and more technologies behind you. So, for example, I started off in the MS-DOS era, and then the Microsoft LAN manager, and then became a NetWare administrator, and then became a Windows NT administrator, and then moved into networking. And then, of course, I started off actually in FIDI networking and ArcNet before I went to Ethernet, and then I went to ATM, and then
man, what did I do here?
Yeah, and then it was IPX, SPX, and I spent a lot of time. IP came very late in my career. I was much more of an Apple Talk, IPS, XPX, SNA, DLSW engineer for many years before I actually started doing TCP/IP, because my career predated TCP. In most corporate networks, we were using something else. And so as those technologies build up behind you, you start to realize that there are certain fundamentals that I take away from all of that learning from years ago. You can bring that forward, and becoming a subject matter expert in a particular technology isn't all that useful, because it's only a matter of time before it's obsolete. So there's no point in being a subject matter expert at some point, because does that make sense? That's a bit of an odd take, but there you go. It's true.
Yeah, I think it's true to a point. I think there's some element at which you do have to prove yourself by becoming the subject matter expert, because that shows your ability to become a subject matter expert in a subject that matters, twisting the words a little bit. Once you've proven that, you don't necessarily have to do it again and again and again, unless you're in an environment that requires it. But then you should question whether that's the environment you want to be in, because you may not have the ability to become more strategic. I mean, I think about it like college at some point. I think the basic, the whole reason to go to the university is not necessarily learning the stuff you're learning or even meeting the people that you're meeting. It's that you prove to future employers that you have the ability to defer gratification, work hard, and suffer a period of relative poverty to accomplish something, which just says, hey, I've got stick-to-itiveness. That's it. That's what you've proven. You got your stick-to-itiveness. Yeah. Here's your degree from Harvard. It proves that you can stick to something for 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, having a university degree basically means you can breathe and walk at the same time, sort of thing. It doesn't actually equip you for the real world, right?
No, it doesn't. But it proves a little more than that. It proves that you can actually undergo pointless nonsense for an extended period of time, because you value what comes after that pointless nonsense.
Yes. And I mean, for a lot of us working in
but yeah.
It is pointless nonsense in the end. Like, my university degree has no relationship to the work that I've done. But it also would point out that most of the work I've done for companies over the last 40 years has been pointless nonsense as well.
Well,
in the
there's
long
that.
term. So you think about the networks that I've built or the contributions I've made to companies, they're all gone now. They've all been replaced with something else. So yes, pointless nonsense.
Once they're far enough in the rear view, anything can look that way. As the noob here, what advice would you give Jonna and I as we carry forward the torch of heavy strategy?
Have fun. So the secret to podcasting is to not take it too seriously. So a lot of the time people talk on podcasts, they get their deep voice out and they
The
talk
NPR
rather
voice.
tendentious. Yeah, the NPR voice, and talk rather tendentiously and crack out a large vocabulary of extended rather odd words and, blah, blah, blah. That is not how people talk. I would say that I've always angled on a podcast as if we're sitting across the coffee table having beer, coffee, insert your favorite beverage here, and we're arguing about something, right? There's a bunch of people who've just met up in a corridor at a conference, or we're co-workers and we have a problem and we're having a casual chat, around the coffee machine. And that means not taking yourself seriously. That is having a laugh, having a joke. It's like the joke about F you for follow-up.
Yes.
Right? People can send their follow-up. Why not call it F you? Because sometimes the follow-up is actually, people flipping you the bird and giving you their honest feedback. And it's also kind of funny, right? A little levity. You don't have to be like, it doesn't have to be dead serious all the time. Life isn't serious all the time. And if you were talking to these people face to face without having a microphone in front of your gob, then you would tell jokes and make it, laugh a bit or relax, that would be one thing, I think.
Well, and I'm laughing about, you're saying life isn't dead serious after you've just finished pretty much saying that it is very important. So at some sense, this is the classic Greg conundrum, or the paradox, not conundrum, paradox, because you're sitting here saying things are incredibly important. You have to think about things in terms of capitalism and what it is and what it could be. And you have to think about what your values are and think about who you are as a person. But hey, don't take yourself too seriously and all of that.
Oh, if you take yourself too seriously, it comes across, right? People hear it and go like, oh, you sound like an idiot, right? And then your podcast.
Sometimes they say that anyway. Actually, when you were talking about the FU, for a while, we were keeping a running tally and we would share these with us because it was literally 50-50. People would write in and say, man, I love heavy strategy, but that Greg Farrell, he just needs to shut up and let Jonna talk. And then the other ones would come in and say, I love heavy strategy, but man, that Jonna Johnson, she just needs to shut up and stop yapping and let Greg talk. And we would just keep the score and they were 50-50. Yeah.
That was funny. And we actually had 2 emails that came in a day or two apart.
Back
and one
to back.
said,
Yes.
Greg, you need to stop talking over the top of Jonah so she can listen. And the other one said, Jonah needs to stop talking over the top of Greg so we can hear what Greg said.
Well,
but that was always the format of this show, right? The idea was that we were butting heads, like a high school debate, right?
Yep.
That you don't necessarily want to choose the topic. Like, the teacher gives you a topic like, okay, you're going to be for slavery and you're going to be against slavery. You go like, I don't want to be for slavery.
Right, exactly.
I'm exaggerating, right?
But
probably wouldn't find a skill giving you that. But when I was at school, that was the sort of thing we were, you were given.
Yeah, right. You have to defend the indefensible. Go. Right.
Yeah, that's right. And you're like, yeah.
And that's really how I came on this podcast was, in fact, Greg and I were on a panel session. And this was during the time of COVID. So we had 2,000 or 3,000 live listeners and we were debating 5G. And I got like so excited disagreeing with Greg that I disconnected myself from the panel in front of everybody. And Greg and the rest of the panelists had to cover. And then I rejoined. But meanwhile, the comments were flowing in going, oh, my God, people who actually dare to disagree on a panel. What a concept. And they are respectful. And that was. So that was actually very funny. Well, we're kind of wrapping up, and I think I am putting in my usual delaying tactics because I hate to stop talking to Greg, and I particularly hate it now that we're kind of coming to the end of his tenure at Heavy Strategy. I'm going to ask the question everybody's been asking you, which is, will people be able to reach you in retirement, Greg? And if so, how?
No, I am going dark, as they say. I've been in social media as an influencer since... Well, actually, I've been writing for media since the year 2000. I kind of forgot about that. It was so long ago. I'd actually forgotten I was writing for money for media back in 2000. And then I actually started blogging in 2006. And then I got serious about blogging in 2008. So it's now, and that is where, and in 2008, That was when blogging was all the rage. And we were influencers. And we used to get invited to go to conferences all over the world because the bloggers had to be there. Like TikTok influencers today and YouTube influencers. We were doing that back in 2008, 2009. That is a long time to be in the public eye and to be creating content. If you've been on social media, or you'll see people come and they'll contribute for a couple of years and then they fade away. And that is because it is just hard work, Jonah, because you're in the business of creating content. That's your full-time job at Nemertes. And it's just hard to keep doing that day on day. So I need a detox. I need a break. So certainly for the next 6 months, I am going to be gone, completely going dark. And at that point, I'll then reevaluate. I think I've got enough money for retirement. I'm not 100% sure if I've got enough, and I may have to come back and work. But if I do, I'm pretty sure it won't be in social media or in the public sphere. I think this part of my life is behind me, and I am genuinely struggling with some health issues. I have chronic fatigue, which means I'm constantly tired. My mental acuity is fading as a part of that. And my physical ability my physical stuff is also declining slightly. I'm not life-threateningly ill. It's just a decline, and it's not great. So for me, no, you won't be able to find me, and I don't think I'll be back. I may be if the money doesn't work out. But does that sound reasonable?
That sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
Although a bit disappointing, I know, for listeners. I will throw out one small flare of hope, which is, Greg, you did promise me we'd stay in touch personally as long as I never said anything about networking or technology, and we only talked about some of our other shared interests. So if it's absolutely critical to get in touch with Greg, do reach out to us here on Packet Pushers. packetpushers.net/FU will continue to be there for Heavy Strategy and for all the other great podcasts. So send us your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here and say Packet Pushers continues unchanged.
Yes,
and in
unchanged.
fact, the thing that we don't talk about is that obviously Heavy Strategy is a new show, but we also have Packet Protector, which is cybersecurity, and Heavy Wireless with Keith Parsons, which is just talking about wireless. And we have there's a whole bunch of new shows on the network. The network continues. And, you should go to the website and look at the shows and look and see if any of those are of interest to you and subscribe to them.
And please, if you do have messages for Greg, and send them to packetpushers.net, they will eventually find their way to him in some way, shape, or form. It may not be right away, as you heard. So please check out the site. And there's also more than just the podcasts, by the way. There's also a newsletter, a job board, and a great Slack community where people are chatting, and it's a fun place to be. So please do hit the site. If you would like to talk to me or to John directly, you can reach us at nemertes.com. I've gotten complaints that I say that too quickly, so it's N like Nancy, E-M like Mary, E-R-T like Thomas, E-S like Sam.com, nemertes.com. And we will be continuing to produce the Heavy Strategies podcast, hopefully going in the directions that, in the directions that Greg has forged, and maybe a few new ones. So we look forward to hearing from you, and that's the end of this episode.
As the Cookie Monster says, me not sad because cookie finished, me happy because I had a cookie. And that's a lovely saying. And that's how I look at the time at Packet Pushers.